questions in the online space. We have over 30 people joining us online, so I'll be busy with this. But I'm going to hand over to our chair, Anna Somechi, who's from the African Center for Cities. Anna will be introducing our panelists, and we will proceed over the next hour and a half. There will be time for discussion afterwards. And again, you're most welcome into the space, and it's really good to have you here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists for joining. Thank you, Anna, to now introduce. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all online, and thank you all in person for joining us. I'm sorry that I'm not standing up, but it's easier for the online broadcast. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I can speak up a little bit, at least. Okay, should I? Okay. So thank you once again, and thank you, Susan, and the Department of Anthropology at UCT for hosting us and inviting us. We think this is a very important conversation indeed, and we'll say a little bit more about why we think so. But for now, I just want to start by, well, firstly, maybe briefly introducing who we are. So we are all members of the South African Jews for a Free Palestine. Should I actually stand up? Will you hear me better? Okay, I'll do this. For one of our, I just found this morning, by the way, accidentally. For one of our first Shabbats Against Genocide, we printed this flyer where we said who we are. So I thought it's apt to just read from it briefly. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We are an organization of South African Jews wishing to see and mobilize towards a free Palestine in our lifetimes. We strongly believe in the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, that is repairing the world, or the spirit of repair and reparative justice, which embodies social action and the pursuit of social justice. I'll leave it at that and move on to why we are here. We are here because there's a genocide happening in Palestine as we speak, as we wake up every single day. Please, if you can mute yourselves. This is online teaching. So I just wanted to start by this context, which is the real and actual and most important context, is the fact that there are people, children, adults, men, women, all genders are being killed every single day. Over 40,000 people are known to be dead by this point. Over 15,000 of those are children. And we know that the actual number of deaths is much higher than that, but this is what is on record. We also know that Palestinian people's lives, ways of lives, places of culture, places of worship are being destroyed. We are sitting in a university today, thankfully. We are privileged because all universities in Palestine have been destroyed or harmed beyond repair. So that is just some of the context that is the most important one to emphasize here. And we are here because in that context, and to suppress that context, very often, all too often, the accusation of anti-Semitism is waged against people who dare to speak up against the state of Israel, people who critique Israel's genocidal politics, this offense, as well as the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, that's also ongoing as we speak. People who speak up, who are critical of the Zionist project, which has been genocidal from the beginning, are called anti-Semitic, and therefore the spaces of critique are increasingly closed down. we as Jews find it extremely important to fight that closing down of space, to fight against that sort of censorship, to fight against that is the actual curtailing of academic freedom. Academic boycott is not the curtailment of academic freedom. I don't want to take up too much space, but there are, because we have all these wonderful people speaking, but I just want to contextualize this and just to say that it's for us as activists, for us as South African activists, I mean, you can hear I'm not South African, but I've been here long enough to consider myself such, even if the state won't. But for us, speaking from this place, it's very important to state that indeed it is Zionism that is racist. It is Zionism that is anti-Semitic. Jared will speak to that. I think Jamie, you will too, and not those who are critiquing the Zionist project. I think I'm going to stop there. Maybe just one more note. This is an all-white panel. Also, in the context of South Africa, it's important to emphasize that we are aware of that. There is an interesting history to Jews becoming white in South Africa, something that Mitch Hunter will speak to in his talk on the 4th of October at the School of Education. Ask Leanne if you need more information. But of course, more importantly, as I mentioned just now, Zionism and white supremacy have an unfortunate and known marriage since the beginning. So for us, speaking from South Africa, speaking from a post, imagine the parentheses, apartheid country, it's important to say that fighting for a free Palestine is also always fighting against all forms of racism as well. With that, I would like to introduce, well, you know what, I'm not gonna sit down just yet. I would like to introduce you to this wonderful set of bad Jews. I'm using Stephen Friedman's title, Good Jews, Bad Jews. Bad Jews are the Jews who speak against Zionism, apparently. So firstly, we have Jamie Rosengarten. Jamie is an activist and also a student here at UCT. He's doing an MPhil in theories of justice and inequality, and is a member of SAJFP, but also the KPU's Collective Kaiko and other grassroots organizations. Jared is an old friend and also an activist focused on building social movements that can transform the world that we live in. Jared has a PhD in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies from Columbia University. Next to Jared is Joe Bloom, also, obviously, I'm not going to say this, a member of SAJFP, clearly, a writer, educator, and activist who's based in South Africa. They are currently finishing a PhD at the London School of Economics. They teach, write, and research on the intersections between colonial genocide and apartheid internationalisms in law and politics. Aside from SAJFP, Joe is a member of several other movements involved in anti-oppressive politics. Fourth, we have Megan Short, who's a writer, performer, improviser, and theater maker. Megan is also an anti-Zionist South African Jew. She studied at UCT during apartheid, and her recent novel is titled Lost Property. And firstly, we will have Jamie speaking. So Jamie, with that.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be sharing my perspectives and experiences as an anti-Zionist Ashkenazi Jewish student at UCT, who is also importantly a young white South African born after the end of formalized apartheid. And I begin by specifying this fact as my relationship to Judaism is inextricably bound with my broader positionality with the contemporary South African continent. Like most Jewish people in South Africa, I am the ancestors of victims of forced removal in Eastern Europe. I equally lost much of my family in the Holocaust, and like most Jewish people in South Africa, most of my ancestors found themselves on these shores after fleeing persecution and oftentimes genocide in the countries of their birth. However, from the moment they arrived in South Africa, my family, like all other Ashkenazi people, were politically and economically considered white. They could own land from which Black people had been previously forcibly dispossessed. They had access to loans and credit. They could work in jobs reserved for white-owned white labor. They could travel freely without needing a dompas. And once naturalized, they could vote and run for office. This isn't to negate the persecution they suffered in South Africa, where after all, the NP were openly anti-Semitic and ardent supporters of the Nazis party. It's also not to negate the fact that Judaism's historical relationship to whiteness in South Africa was tenuous, as Mitchell Hunter from SHFP will be presenting on at a future point. Rather, it's to acknowledge that under apartheid and colonial rule, racial classification, Jewish people were afforded the same structural privileges and power over, not power with, afforded to all white South Africans. While my family arrived in South Africa as refugees, displaced by a racialized form of ethnic cleansing, by the time I was born, they assumed the wealth, privilege, and power associated with whiteness. I begin with this extended contextualization as it bears great relevance to a famous quote that has followed me and many Jewish people across their lives. It's a quote that is written in many history books and appears on the walls of many Holocaust memorials around the world. It's a quote which was initially uttered by the liberated prisoners at Buchenwald concentration camp and simply demands never again. While simple and evocative, this quote has been contorted to all different sorts of purposes. At this moment, as white South African Jews, we are again faced with a critical and unavoidable choice in how we interpret this demand. Never again will we allow Jewish people to be subject to oppression and genocidal violence, or never again will we allow the systems, the logic, and the state's craftsmanship that produce said violence to reproduce in any given context or towards any given victim. Will we exceptionalize the violence of the Holocaust and close ourselves off to our own complicity in a project of elimination at home? Or will we understand that never again for me means never again for you and never again for any of us? Will we show no remorse for continued benefiting off of the colonial legacy in South Africa, emigrate to Israel, and emerge as active settlers once more? Or will we meaningfully grapple with our colonial legacy, and in doing so, hurl ourselves into the fight for justice against all forms of colonialism, domination, and imperialism in South Africa, in Palestine, and across the globe? To me, as a white South African born after the end of formalized party and a country where it still possesses significant economic, social, and political power, albeit having been embraced in a project of nation building, however deeply flawed, which is still significant, this decision was clear-cut. Judaism has long provided a useful mechanism for me to rationalize and make sense of this decision. Across my life, Judaism has always provided a spiritual and perhaps at times a metaphysical way to locate myself within a broader South African context. What appealed and what resonates to me about Judaism was that how it provides community through heterogeneity. To be Jewish is to debate, I was taught that to be Jewish was to debate, to reflect, to critically think, to encourage communities of difference, and above all, to strive for justice. To be Jewish was to embrace principles of tikkun olam and doikiyat, where tikkun olam broadly refers to various forms of actions intended to repair and improve the world, and doikiyat to a sense of here-ness. While both terms are often hollowed out and used in a deeply neoliberalized sense, when applied radically, their meaning is of deep significance. It means, as white Jews in South Africa, we do not derive purpose due to some faraway utopic place, but through the here and now, through building anti-capitalist alternatives and communities of solidarity in the places we currently work and live right here, right now. In the famous words of Marek Edelman, the Jewish Polish political activist, member of the Socialist Bund, and last surviving leader of the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, to be a Jew means always being with the oppressed and never the oppressor. This understanding has seemingly implicitly and explicitly guided many white South African Jews who are at the forefront of the struggle against apartheid. Growing up, perhaps as a way to object my own whiteness and complicity, historic complicity in colonial rule, I took great solace at their legacy. However, while a minority of Jews were actively at the forefront of the fight against apartheid, the majority of the Jewish community, and particularly the institutionalized bodies which claim to represent all Jewish voices, such as the South African Zionist Federation and South African Jewish Board of Deputies, were either complicit or actively proponents of apartheid, to the extent that the Slovos, the Dennis Goldbergs, the Ronnie Caswells of the world were actively vilified and ostracized from their community, to the extent that in 1985, the chief rabbi of South Africa apologized for the community's role in apartheid. Not much has changed since. SAJFP, like many Jews before us in South Africa and across the diaspora, reject the idea that Jewish safety requires a Jewish nation state, which perpetually justifies the abominable treatment of Palestinians. We reject this on the basis of how it positions both us and Palestinians. On the one hand, it propagates a deeply racist idea that Palestinian people are inherently dangerous and unsafe to live with. On the other hand, it propagates an incredibly dangerous sense of Jewish identity, where as Jews, we are defined in relation to our suffering, in relation to our victimization. What type of political project tells you that your safety can only come when you ostracize yourselves from others, when you put yourself in a tiny enclave, and when you cannot fundamentally live with your neighbors? Well, this understanding has seemingly implicitly and explicitly guided many South African Jews, and has been shared by Jews in the South Africa and diaspora, both historically and now. As SAJFP, we, at this point and at no point in the future, make any claim that this represents a single unified Jewish voice. We may not disagree with Zionists. We may in fact be abhorred and disgusted by the extent to which they will pervert our religion to justify a political campaign of genocidal proportions. However, we will not reject them. We will not reject the basis of their Judaism. We do not perceive Judaism to be a fixed identity. We perceive it to emerge in its fluidity. The same cannot be said for most of the institutionalized Jewish bodies in South Africa and UCT itself, who claim to represent all Jews and represent our interests in a single unified bloc, which is intrinsically tied to Zionism and intrinsically tied to the preservation of an ethno-nationalist nation state. The fluidity of Judaism is functionally erased, and to be a Jew is to support an idea of blood and soil. This bears particular relevance in the context of South Africa, where soldiers whose parents' body is SAJBD and the South African Zionist Federation claims to be the sole representative of all Jewish voices on campus. However, soldiers until recently declared that their three main guiding principles was Judaism, South Africa, and Zionism. This effectively means that us on the panel effectively have the organization which is meant to represent us as Jews views us as an unavoidable inconvenience, something which can't fit neatly into their paradigm of what Judaism represents. This bears great significance as the only time institutions like soldiers will take a publicly facing role on campus is once a year during Israeli Apartheid Week, when the only body which is meant to represent all Jewish voices will only be publicly visible in a 1 week a year, which is internationally recognized due to its credence in the anti-apartheid struggle, when they will do this on the basis of representing your voices, when they will stand with IDF soldiers. This is a position which fundamentally contributes to the unsafety of Jews on campus. This fundamentally contributes to our unsafety. Thank you. Contribute to our own safety. So recently, and the point to emphasize as SAJFP is this doesn't represent all Jews within campus. At the moment, we have currently set up reading groups where progressive Jewish students actively meet to forge an alternative sense of community, a community which isn't grounded in the sense of Janus. However, a point to emphasize is we are forced to conduct these reading groups often in privacy and can't publicly advertise them due to the fear of vilification, potential violence, and threats that we would receive from many within our broader community. It's for this reason that the recent motions which passed through council were actively immensely felt by me and many Jewish students because it was a significant step in actively protecting our safety on campus. If the only institutional body which claims to represent Jews has actively tells us that we can't stand under their banner if we are propagating any support from Palestine, that means in legitimate instances of anti-Semitism, there is no active way that we could get our voices heard. We are removed from a broader anti-racist framework, and the violence of the Holocaust is exceptionalized and associated with this ethno-nationalistic project. I say that just to contextualize the significance of the recent motions that passed through Senate. Because while, like Jewish people throughout history, we endeavor to create alternative spaces despite the ostracization we would receive amongst those who formally claim to represent our voices. The institution has great power and responsibility to help us as students do that and to protect us as we are doing that. So I end off with an appeal to UCT to meaningfully recognize the heterogeneity of Jewish voices and to take active steps to protect Jewish students who currently are actively made unsafe by the manner in which their religion is institutionally represented and contorted. I also end with a brief call to Zionist Jews, as I am thinking about the importance of freedom dreaming right now. Freedom dreaming in the context of Palestine and freedom dreaming in the context of South Africa. Because healing from Zionism means healing from the atrocities of the Holocaust. But there's been no adequate healing. There can be no adequate healing as long as the nation state of Israel exists. There could be no healing process for Jewish people to move beyond victimization. Hence the ubiquity of, but Israel has the right to exist and it's us or them. We won't be safe without our own state. It's an incredible tragedy that what is lost in these statements is the capacity to imagine. Colonialism is not just about power, it is about weakness. It restricts thought, it restricts freedom, and it restricts imagination. I've been thinking about South African freedom dreaming a lot too. The call to multiracialism was a radical stance where the anti-apartheid movement was dedicated to a dream that many thought was unfathomable. While this dream is incomplete, perhaps we could apply the famous Nelson Mandela quote in the other way. Just as the freedom of South Africa is incomplete without the freedom of Palestine is incomplete without the freedom of South Africa. I think this now because Zionists cannot imagine a state of freedom, and this is based on the image they have of Palestinians, but also of themselves. What does it really mean to think of yourself as not being able to live amongst others, to constantly have to close yourself off to the joy of the world? How can we emancipate the desire to dream, to hope, and to live a social life that is not dependent on state authorizing you to do what is possible, what is real, and dictating the limits of your imagination? This dream goes beyond documents, laws, and states. It is a big dream. It is a wild dream. It is a dream of freedom. It is a dream for hope. And it is the only thing that drives change. Zionism is antithetical to freedom. Zionism is antithetical to dreaming. For if your freedom is tied to ethno-nationalism, it can never be said to be freedom at all. And I look forward to constructing an alternative reality. Yeah, I derive great pleasure in the work SAJFP and other organizations do at this endeavor of freedom dreaming for a just future in both Palestine and South Africa. Thank you.
Some computers.
I'll try. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you. It's hard to go after Jamie. My talk will be a lot more subdued and technical. unfortunately, but hopefully you'll still find it helpful. I'm talking about the origins of Zionism. Now, Zionism, just to define it, is the belief that a religious or spiritual community known as Jews are a separate, single national people who should be resettled as a sovereign political entity, a nation state in historic Palestine. I'm going to put forward a brief and selective history of Zionism. It does not intend to cover all of the history of Zionism, but hopes to clarify a few points for everyone. Sorry? Oh, okay. I'll speak up. Sorry about that. My focus here is Zionism before 1948, when world powers declared the state of Israel and the Nakba, or Palestinian catastrophe, led to the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians and their ethnic cleansing from most of historic Palestine. Let me begin first with a question for people in the audience. And so I'm going to require your participation. Who can tell me who is the founder of Zionism? Who came up with the ideas that Jews are going to settle in Palestine? Can anyone? Yeah. You go. Yeah. Theodor Herzl. Anyone else? Okay. Most Jews will answer this question in one of two ways. One, they would simply say that Theodor Herzl is the founder of Zionism. Indeed, that is true that he's the founder of Zionism as a coordinated political movement. But he is not the first Zionist, and he's not the first person to advocate Jewish settlement or colonization of Palestine. Others would refer to religion when talking about the origins of Zionism. They will talk about, they will say that Zionism has always been part of the Jewish religion and culture, and since the destruction of the Second Temple, and Jews spread throughout the globe. But this position is also incorrect. Though historically Jewish religious teachings and prayer often did speak to a desire to return to Jerusalem, this was a spiritual matter, not a political one. This was about the spiritual desire to be closer to God. It was not a political ideology that sought the creation of the Jewish colony in the state of Palestine. So the real answer to this question goes back to the 16th century. One of the first people to advocate as an explicitly ideological project for Jews to leave Europe and move en masse to Palestine was Martin Luther, the founder of Protestant Christianity. In his early years, Luther, seeking to define his sect against Catholicism, had condemned the Catholic Church's persecution of Jews and embraced Hebrew as a holy language. However, as the political situation shifted, Luther's position did as well. He began blaming Jews for various social and religious ills and calling for their mass conversion. Of course, Luther did not found something called Zionism. No one called it that back then. But what he did do was he challenged the Catholic Crusader doctrine, and instead he advocated for European Jews to leave Europe and colonize Palestine under a religious doctrine that would hasten the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was the beginning of Christian millenarianism. But Martin Luther was a political figure as much as a religious one. He hoped not just to transform Christianity and purify it, but to transform his society and to make it less dependent on the Vatican. He linked this to the anti-Semitic and supremacist notion that Europe was meant to be a Christian land, and that Jewish resettlement could be a political tool to achieve this. So while Luther never used the term Zionism, in effect, he was one of the first Zionists. I've been drawing on primarily on a groundbreaking book from the 1980s by Regina Sharif called Non-Jewish Zionism. Sharif refuses the designation Christian Zionism because while it has its origins in Christianity and its justification in religious doctrine, its motivation is primarily political. So Briefly here, there are some other Christian Zionists or non-Jewish Zionists worth mentioning. For example, in England, there was another key site of early Zionism around the same time of the Reformation in continental Europe. When the Church of England broke with the Catholic Church, you saw the rise of millenarian theologians and politicians such as Francis Kett, Thomas Brightman, and Sir Henry Finch. Brightman can be considered the father of the British doctrine of the restoration of Jews to Palestine. Later, Finch explicitly advocated for the creation of a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. Later, the rise of English Puritans and the Calvinists in Holland pushed the millenarian belief in the end of times. Their role was expanding this idea of the restoration. Among Christians, the doctrine of Jewish restoration became increasingly popular in the 1700s and 17th and 18th centuries. But none of this was out of love or concern for Jews, but because of political reasons and the Jewish role in God's plan to bring about the end of times. Also important to note is that it was this non-Jewish Zionist movement that first began to define Jews as a single homogeneous nation. Not just a people in the religious biblical sense, but a singular ethnic or racial polity. Most Jews at the time obviously were terrified by anti-Semitism in general, which led to pogroms and other forms of persecution. But they also quite rightly rejected these Christian projects to expel them from Europe and move them to Palestine. The idea of a singular Jewish nation was roundly rejected by Jews. Judaism was a religion that incorporated a multitude of peoples of varying cultures from all over the world. There was no sense in treating Jews from Germany as of the same ethnic background as Jews from North Africa or Persia or Ethiopia. We have a common religion, but not a common race or ethnicity. However, there were a few rabbis at the time who responded positively to Christian millenarianism. Some had messianic ideas that mapped closely with that of Christian Zionists. These included Manasseh ben Israel, the rabbi of Amsterdam. It also included Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, a Jewish mystic who set out for Jerusalem around 1700. But these were early Jewish Zionists who were not a significant factor in Jewish communities in Europe. They were very, very marginal. Now, the rise of political non-Jewish Zionism. By the 1700s, you have the rise of political Zionism amongst non-Jews. For instance, you have Danish merchant Oliver Polly, who in the 1700s advocated the establishment of a Jewish empire between the Black Sea and the Red Sea. This was meant as an extension of Christian Europe. Napoleon, who is well known for decreeing the emancipation of Jews, called Jews to arms in the creation of a Palestinian state. Then in the 1800s and 1900s, with British colonization, you have direct calls for setting up Jewish colonies in Palestine under the protection of the British Empire. Lord Balfour, a rabid anti-Semite, pushed through the Aliens Act to prevent Jews from coming from Eastern Europe into Britain. Instead, he offered Uganda and then later Palestine for Jewish colonization. Lord Chamberlain similarly pushed for Jewish colonies in Cyprus and in the Sinai. Churchill, also a rabid anti-Semite who hated Jews, concocted conspiracy theories of Jewish Bolsheviks taking over the world. He differentiated between the good Jews, the Zionists, and the bad Jews, the socialists and Bolsheviks. Why is all this important? It shows that Zionism has been historically bound up with anti-Semitism. Its very genesis was within an anti-Semitic worldview. It cannot be understood as a movement without this history. Its justification has always been based on the idea that Jews did not belong in Europe. Now, the rise of Jewish Zionism. In the 1800s, with the rise of nationalism in Europe, we saw the beginnings of what could be termed Jewish Zionism. Key figures include Moses Hess, Leon Pinsker, Ahad Ha'am, and of course, Theodor Herzl. But these figures remained marginal in Jewish communities throughout Europe. Most communities rejected these Zionist ideas. Let's focus on Herzl, for instance. He was the classic example of the assimilationist Jew. He had a close bond with German culture. His original plan was to solve the Jewish problem through mass baptism to Christianity. Note that this was Martin Luther's first solution to the Jewish problem as well. When Herzl realized that true assimilation was impossible because anti-Semitism was based on race and that Jews would be targeted regardless of their assimilation, he then decided that the creation of the Jewish state was necessary. But Herzl wanted a Jewish state in the image of Germany. In his novel about the Jewish state, its inhabitants spoke German, went to the opera, and did a whole number of German cultural things. Ultimately, Herzl's Zionism was based on self-hatred. Zionism and the founding of the Jewish state was as much about protecting Jews as it was about civilizing them. Many of these ideas he drew directly from his right-hand man, Max Nordau. Nordau, influenced by scientific Darwinism and eugenics, defined the old Jew in prejudicial terms as weak and uncivilized. He wanted to design a new Jew, a concept he referred to as muscular Judaism. The Jewish state was key to his project, his civilizing project. Again, you can see the parallels with anti-Semitic and racist ideologies. Muscular Judaism is not a far cry from German racist eugenics. So Herzl's ideas were ridiculed by the overwhelming Jewish majority of communities in Europe. The German Rabbinical Council, the Jewish community of Munich, rejected plans to hold the first Zionist Congress in their city. So did many other communities in Europe. This is why the first conference was held in Basel, Switzerland, where very few Jews lived to oppose the Congress. Publishing the Jewish States, a Zionist manifesto, invited ridicule from Jews all over Europe. In his hometown of Vienna, they just thought his ideas were just completely ridiculous. There was a Karl Kraus, someone from a prominent Jew from Vienna, wrote a polemic against Herzl, responding to saying that Zionists respond to the anti-Semitic battle cry, "Out with you Jews," with the submission, "Yes, out with us Jews." So, who supported Herzl and the Zionists? Herzl's prominent supporters were in the beginning were not Jews, but Christian anti-Semites. They loved the idea of getting rid of Jews and getting them off the continent. His other supporters were British colonialists who saw Jewish colonization of Palestine as an extension of British capitalist interests, especially because of its key location as at a crossroads of Euro-Asian trade. Probably the most shocking link between Zionism and anti-Semitism, however, concerns the Nazis. When the Nazis first came to power in Germany, Jews in the Americas launched the anti-Nazi boycott. But some Jewish groups, specifically some Zionist groups, opposed the boycott. They had their own interests. In 1933, the Zionist Federation of Germany and the Anglo-Palestine Bank negotiated the Havarah Agreement, or transfer agreement with Nazi Germany. This pact enabled the sale of Jewish property in Germany to Germans and the transfer of 60,000 German Jews to Palestine. In exchange, the Nazis were able to facilitate emigration of Jews out of their country, as well as break the anti-Nazi boycott, which posed a threat to the Nazi German economy. This pact between the Zionists and the Nazis is no fluke. As I have shown, the history of Zionism is bound up with anti-Semitism, and we see this continuing today. Netanyahu's political friends are the anti-Semites of this world. For example, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Donald Trump in the United States. Thank you.
I'm going to keep it on if that's, I'm going to keep my mask on if that's okay. Can you hear me? Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Anthropology Department and to all of you for giving of your time to think with us and sort of big act to follow. Thank you, comrades. I think so. Can I make this on silent? Is that okay? All right, thanks. No. Okay, good. So I think I'm going to speak specifically about, I sort of tentatively called this talk of a paper that I'm working on called Not the IHRA, or How Do We Remember the Holocaust Actually? And it's sort of a collection sorry, I must just take the, yeah. A collection of a number of ideas I've been thinking of for quite a while around how we think about the Nazi Holocaust in Europe in relation to the broader project of colonial genocide, as many anti-colonial scholars for generations have been urging us to do. How we think of it in terms of what it offers in terms of anti-Semitism, and broadly how it creates what colonizers love to do, fictions of separability between anti-Semitism on the one hand and other forms of violence, between the Nazi Holocaust in Europe and other forms of genocidal imperial violence. And I think it's particularly apt, so I'm going to kind of segue from, because you've done so much fantastic history and location, and I appreciate this so much, but I think sort of to bring us back into the South African context, just to mirror some of these interconnected kind of interstices between white supremacy, apartheid internationalisms, and Holocaust memory, is also to remember that one of the most ardent supporters of the Zionist project in South Africa was Jan Smuts, who is sort of celebrated. There's a kibbutz named after him in occupied Palestine. He had a very, very close relationship with and was instrumental in writing the Balfour Declaration. Attended the San Francisco conference in '45 when the kind of multilateral architecture was being discussed and kind of advocated. He was the one that put the term human in the UN Charter, human rights. But of course, what we know is the human to whom Jan Smuts was referring was what I understand from Caribbean thinker Sylvia Wynter, the overrepresentation of white bourgeois Christian man as if he were the human himself. So I think this is a bit of a context, and I think it's very important to note that Smuts was very compelled by Zionism, precisely because he saw links between Afrikaner nationalism and this kind of push for a notion of a whitened indigeneity. What I'm sort of starting to understand is this idea of an actual settler colonial people, kind of what Eve Tuck and Yang referred to as kind of moves to settler innocence, right? So this idea that we are actually indigenous to the land in the way that an Afrikaner nationalist pact was created in South Africa. We see a very similar, I think, move towards a settler indigeneity in Palestine. And I think this is, just to kind of bring some of this history into our context, I think is important. So I kind of want to bring this into our conversations about the university and the stakes of these questions. And I'm so glad that Anna opened by reminding us, the context in which we are operating, right? This is an all-out genocide that is a highly, highly escalated, technology-enhanced instantiation of the ongoing Nakba that has structured life and death in Palestine, resistance and survival since before the establishment of the apartheid state in '48, in the same year that the apartheid state was established here, interconnected. So So this is the context. We are seeing an all-out scholasticide. We are seeing direct targeting of universities. That most of the universities have been bombed, but still they persist. Scholars, academics, students working together to make waves. You know, the resistance is remarkable. Targeting of academics, targeting of students, and all of these things. And I think this is crucially important to kind of bring us into the stakes. Now, in an article this week at Al Jazeera, Samdik Sen, who I think is from Denmark, he's not from Denmark, but he's based at a Danish Copenhagen University, I believe. He opens an article with, "Politics should be kept out of academia." This is how many in Western academia. No, he's cool. He's cool. He's a comrade. Don't judge him yet. This is how many in Western academia respond to calls from fellow professors and students for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. Right? So we see calls for freedom of speech, for civil discourse, right? For not keep your politics out of the classroom. Correct? Now, I want to know, how do you keep politics out of the classroom when you are literally talking about an annihilatory genocidal regime that is ongoing? And we must pretend to our students that we are not living, we are actively participating in the normalization of settler colonial apartheid and genocide if we're not talking about this. I'm going off track. I have 3 points. I'll get there. But I think I think that this is. I really just want to say this and commend our senators and the students who protested relentlessly to make this possible. Campers, our staff members, the various people working in the background, the workers at this university who clean the classrooms after everyone leaves the fancy seminars, every single person who has contributed in many ways to kind of pushing the university to take seriously the need for an academic boycott. And I think, as we know, and the university, several colleagues around have organized several different seminars around the deep complicity of the Israeli university, of the Israeli academy, in the genocide, in the maintenance of settler colonialism, right? We know this from whether it's military training, whether it's special programs for soldiers, any number, I'm not giving the details now, but any number of us can speak to that. How am I doing time? 10 minutes, 5 minutes to go. Good, okay. So I just want to come to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a very curious one, because it is, as I read it, actually quite, it's quite, and I think not surprising given what we've just heard, but actually quite a minimalist and quite problematic understanding of anti-Semitism as a form of structural oppression. Because we know that obviously, while it is weaponized to silence various forms of pro-Palestinian discourse and to repress, we obviously know that anti-Semitism is a major, major problem globally. And as the far right and the fascists and global kind of moves towards right-wing populism or fascism are becoming emboldened globally, manifesting in things that we're seeing like xenophobia, like anti-Blackness, like white supremacy, like various forms of queerphobia, ableism, capitalism. Obviously, anti-Semitism is part of the deal because these struggles are connected. Now, and let me read this definition per the IHRA. It says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Now, structural oppression is not a perception. It can be, but it's a structure, right? So I think, and I am urged by Palestinian scholar Muhammad Ayash to think of Zionism in the context of colonial modernity, right? So we are talking in the aftermath of 1492, right? The signing of the papal bull, which effectively makes Jewish people, Muslim people, Black people, sort of sets the way for what was called the kind of discovery of the New World, the Columbus journeys, the settler colonial genocides in North America, the colonization and genocides across Africa, Asia, all over the world. And as part of this, we see it's part of the Spanish Inquiry. There's a long history to this, which I think Jared has covered. So I want to kind of set that there. And I think just let me finally make these 3 points that I've been planning to get to. And I think the one is the first that it sort of sets up the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as if it is exceptional, right? Now, it's the first record. The Holocaust has been appropriated as a term that is given primordial usage with reference to the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, and often narrowed down specifically to speak only about Jewish victims, absenting all the other victims. We know the first recorded term, the use of the term Holocaust, was also the first recorded use of the term crime against Black American journalist and historian George Washington Williams, with reference to the Congo Free State, Leopold's rule there. And that was the first time the term Holocaust was used. So we see that this term is deeply implicated in anti-Black, white supremacist, colonial, capitalist forms of one, occupation of territory, or Lebensraum, as we kind of have come to understand it through European terms, but we can see a very similar logic, as Zoe Samudzi points out in her excellent work on genocide studies, that the idea of Lebensraum, in fact, also translates into what we see in Namibia with the genocide of the Overher and Nama people, which marked the beginning of this century. And we also see, obviously, continuums with forms of colonial genocide, dispossession, and apartheid that have marked the South African state in its various instantiations since its occupation. And I just want to sort of come to this quote from Césaire from Discourse on Colonialism, where he says, "Yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside of him, that Hitler that inhabits him, and if he rails against him, Hitler is his demon." But it is the crime against white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures. So I think just, I'm going to speed through the next 2 points because I'm conscious of the time, but just to kind of hold that, I don't think it does anything for anyone to misrepresent history as if the Nazi Holocaust were a unique genocide. I think we can attend to the gravity, hold, as Jamie urges, hold our ancestors very, very close, while not demanding of them this perpetual instrumentalization to be weaponized for another fascist genocide. I think I want to take care, and I think just to kind of bring that forward, I think by the same token, that translates into our logics of how we understand anti-Semitism as separable from other forms of oppression. And I think, in fact, this limitation of the very definition of anti-Semitism to something about perceptions, as opposed to deeply sustained structures of colonial modernity, does no service to Jews. I personally, as Jamie introduced Doikite, we are here to work in coalition with where we are. Jewish sensibilities for millennia have been anarchic, moved over space and time without connection to a sense of nation state. And I think I very much hope that the next time we are invited to speak, if we are, we won't have to be the Jews talking about this, because it's basic understanding that it's basic history. But yeah, thank you for your time. From the river to the sea.
Hello, everybody.
Yes, sorry, Megan.
My name is Megan. I am a South African. I am a Jew, and I'm an anti-Zionist. And I'd like to have a very informal, very personal chat with you because I'm not an academic. I am a performer, I'm a writer, I'm an improviser. I don't have a lot prepared. But some of you might know me from TV because I played Darren's mom, Janice, in Tully's Wedding Diaries. I'm that Jewish mother. And the reason why I want to start with that is because up until not long ago, I was a good Jew. I was celebrated for my role as Janice in Tully's Wedding Diaries. I had also directed and co-written a play with the amazing Chantal Stanfield called From Kusistes to Knedlach, which was all about how a brown woman from Cape Town ended up meeting a white Jewish boy from Joburg and how they fell in love. And so, and then I wrote a book. I wrote a novel called Lost Property, which was a lot about growing up in apartheid in a kind of Joburg Jewish middle-class home and what that meant. So up until not that long ago, up until just a little bit before the 7th of October, I was being celebrated by the Jewish community. I was being interviewed and people were asking me questions, and I was quite comfortably sharing my anti-Zionist stance, but still being celebrated as somebody who was a little bit weird, a little bit of an out there Jew, but someone who Jews wanted to identify with. And things have changed. Things have changed horribly for me. Things have changed quite scarily for me. And I identify very strongly with those people, those Jewish people who are beginning their journey and trying to find their way out of this terrible vice of Zionism that has throttled humanity and conscious thinking and community and service and good ideas and anti-whiteness and anti-racism and anti-apartheid, and has throttled any kind of thinking and has made Jewish people scared because of the family that they're going to lose and the face that they lose in Jewish communities and the rejection that they suffer. And of course, the absolutely intolerable being called a bad Jew, not a real Jew, and an anti-Semite. It's horrible. So my fall out of Jewish favor has been very painful for me. And I want to just share an anecdote with you. This is something that happened, I think, in about 2019, just before COVID. I was, I think because of Tully's Wedding Diaries, and I think because of From Kusistes to Knedlach, I was invited to go and talk to a lot of the Jewish old communities of Cape Town, and I went to go and chat to them, and we had discussions, and I told them that I was an anti-Zionist, and some of them kind of went, you know, and others were like, oh, what, I wonder what that is. And so there was that kind of discussion, but I was never vilified or ostracized or ignored. It was part of who I was, and it's only become a problem now. And so that's part of the reason why I am always loud and always clear that Zionism is apartheid. Zionism is, and that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism.
I don't know how more to say that it isn't, but it's sometimes just important for me to be here and to be present as a person, a Jew, a South African, and an anti-Zionist.
And comments, and I hope because of the wonderful attendance both here and online that we'll have many comments and questions. I will try to take them in the room, and I'll be looking online. Susan will be looking online so that everyone is attended to. Who would like to start? Yes, please.
I want to thank all the panelists fantastically. And I do want to thank Joe particularly for reminding me about something. Because I think the idea that academia is not about politics is a very present issue. I'm going to a conference next week. I was looking at the workshop. Should epidemiologists be advocates? I think I know this person. What are you going to say? And it took me back to 1976. I was at school. And I was a real goody two-shoes at school. Never did anything wrong, but I got thrown out of class because the teacher wouldn't actually recognize that kids were being shot in Soweto. And it was something that I couldn't deal with. And it's the same thing now. As Jews, we can't just keep quiet. And politics is everywhere. So in our organizations, our university organizations we belong to, that's a big struggle. So thank you for that.
Yes, please. If you don't mind standing up and speaking up, especially, please.
I have a lot of things to say. The first one is thank you not just for being here today, but just your existence and what you do. The first thing that I noted down was related to what Jamie was saying about safety and hypocrisy.
Some people can't hear, sorry.
The first thing I noted was related to what Jamie was saying regarding safety and hypocrisy, and also this idea of levels and layers to safety, from like needing and having this homeland to this victim mentality at a very individual level, claiming to be a voice or a safe space, but actively suppressing heterogeneity and making critical voices feel unsafe. I have experienced this even here. I feel deeply unsafe because my family does not know my stance. If you don't mind sharing, how do you experience and work through this unsafety? Do I ask the next ones as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
How can we improve access to anti-Zionist knowledge and perspectives, especially for adults and children who have only ever been exposed to one story? You'll know what it means when I say that I went to Herzliya from preschool to matric. The first time I ever encountered an opposing view that wasn't immediately shut down or branded as anti-Semitic from whatever it was first year university, and because I didn't have that Zionist scaffolding to fall back onto, I actually started to question things, and I'm now like, I call myself like a reformed Zionist because I was Zionist by default until I realized what it actually meant. And third question is, what kind of role do you think media literacy is playing in Zionist propaganda?
Last point, you just think with us about what the idea of a reformed Zionist is, and my question was more on what is this thing that everyone's talking about now, liberal Zionist? Can you just help us, because we know what the liberal argument is around the whiteness generally, but maybe you can say something.
If there isn't an immediate further question, then I think I'll take these back to the panel, and then we should collect the round from online participants. So there were questions around liberal Zionism. How can we access anti-Zionist knowledge? How do we all navigate this unsafety that most often comes from within the most intimate circles of our lives, right? But also institutionally, and please let me know if I left anything out. Who would like to begin?
I'd like to begin. I'd like to talk about not being safe. And I think I also grew up in a Zionist, I mean, I'm an old lady, but I grew up in a Zionist home and a Zionist situation. And I have never felt more safe in my loudness about anti-Zionism because of the community of extraordinary people who, it's quite embarrassing sometimes how well protected I am by amazing people who often express gratitude for my position, which is embarrassing. But it's my counter to my family, to a community who's now decided, and they don't make me feel unsafe. I feel safe.
I think also just to add to that, the sense of safety and fear, it manifests in different levels, but I think it's very real. I say that in the sense that it does come from ostracization from your family, but just to reflect personally, I think does represent an experience of many in SAJFD. Since being publicly anti-Zionist, I, myself and my family have received a lot of death threats, threats of sexual violence, have been called all sorts of things that I think would be inappropriate to repeat in an academic forum like this one. You know, that, yeah, threats of physical harm. At times have been worried that I have been tailed by different people. I've had my family called at odd times of the night and told that I've been arrested. I supposedly have a dossier which has been sent to all the various international universities and the various embassies because of the positions I've taken. So I think, yeah, that does just provide a bit of the context as to where some of this fear is coming from. I don't think it's necessarily just unique to me. And similar to Megan, what solves that is finding solace in community. Since October the 7th, Judaism has resonated with me in a way that it hasn't in the last few years. I've been exposed firstly to a community of other Jewish people who have, you know, interpreted a similar meaning towards it, but it's also been an incredibly unifying thing for me in terms of the broader Cape Town, which is historically a city that could be deeply isolating and deeply embedded with power. You know, that anti-Zionism, showing that the links to justice in South Africa and justice in Palestine interlinked, has provided access to incredibly emancipatory, both politically but also personal communities. And I think that's where the safety comes into it, you know, that it's being in those communities and not allowing Zionists to ostracize you necessarily.
Just to add on to what Jamie and Megan are saying, and I don't want, and I absolutely do not want to minimize the sense of lack of safety and the risks, but we also need to put it into context, because compared to the risks that we take, the risks that we take are nothing compared to the risks that other people take to support Palestine. There are people literally dying right now, and so we do need to put it in that context as well. So we are taking small risks as part of our obligation, and I think we should always be cognizant of that.
Please also get the other questions as we respond for you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start with, so first of all, thank you for that point. And I think there is, yeah, I mean, there's no pedagogy without a notion of power. It's impossible. I can't. Anyway, I think I would agree with many of the points raised. And maybe also there's a fantastic article, and I can't remember the name of the author, in Parapraxis magazine, which is an online magazine of psychoanalysis. And I read it a while ago, but they're taking up this concept of Jewish security and Jewish safety, like on in a campus space, and what this also means in linking it, especially in the context, and this is not to assume a wide heterogeneity of Jews globally, but very often in Ashkenazi communities, you do have a predominantly white or whitened Jewish community. And I think when we think about safety and security, I think we also just need to also think about that in the broader context of, for example, even within South Africa, extraordinary police violence is not really meted out on white protesters, or quite as often as it is, in fact, by any stretch, as it is on Black South Africans, right? We know that notions of safety and security are tied up in often very anti-Black and very racist notions of security and securitization. So I think just to kind of keep this there, that's not to say that there aren't struggles. I think perhaps, if I'm to sort of speak between the different points that have come up here, I think perhaps I agree with it being about community. And I think that, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore called rehearsals for the revolution, and I think when you think about the actual stakes, so your auntie's a little pissed off with you. It's not the end of the world. Sorry for my language, but it is, I think there are death threats on the one hand, which we all, unfortunately comes with the territory. We do record them though, in case anyone is watching, and we archive them and we follow up on them if we need to. But I think to kind of think about community and practice, I guess, acts of bravery every day in small ways that move us from this idea that we ought to have a kinship relationship with those who kind of extort our notion of kinship to be associated with a fascist ethno-state. So I think that's a move to kind of to maybe think about that in terms of I think what I didn't get your name, but yeah, I think what you're talking about is very important, because I think this is a socialization process. It's a myth. Zionism thrives on mythology, right? It's so much of it. It almost is like, it's like arguing with an atheist about God. It sort of exists and it's wrong and it's right and you can't prove it, but you can prove it, but it's here and it's there. And eventually you just get this God figure. It's a political theology. And it thrives on mistruths being represented as fact. And so it's not just about how do we teach differently, I think reading groups, I think all of these things, but it's about thinking about the very structures and mechanics of these foundational myths that take our children and socialize them into something that that's ridiculous. So I think that's the one thing. I think on the liberal Zionism, I think it's a really important question. I think on the one hand, we all know liberalism's deep implication in colonialism, right? So I think it's another way on that level of saying colonial Zionism. I think, would you say like liberal white supremacy, gentle fascism, just a tablespoon of homophobia. So I don't know what we're supposed to get from this. I think what we are seeing, and especially there's this, I don't know how many have followed this little Zionist conference that was supposed to be happening in Joburg. I don't know what's happening with that, but I think there's a move to save Israel by presenting a kind of gentler face of Zionism. So it moves from a critique of this settler colonial structure that needs to be abolished in toto to being like, oh, we're still okay with this apartheid state, but that was some bad behavior. And so this move to say, so almost the critique becomes enclosed in the renewalism project. And I think, and very important is this kind of where you see what we refer to as normalization, a kind of slippage between concepts where we allow certain things that are actually pro-genocide stances to masquerade as if it's nuance, debate, both sides. So I would say that would be my understanding. There's some really great literature on this that I can also send around afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I know there are people waiting, and I also know that we are running out of time. We have 14 minutes, and there's someone there who would really like to ask some questions, so please go ahead. And then we'll take
being curious. There's a part of that, like a foundation, which needs to underlie a lot of what is coming through. That is the definition for the colonialism foundation. And my lack of understanding is that, you know, when you talk about like France and Algeria, it's very clear who the mother country is France, and there's a secular country is Algeria. But when it comes to the Jewish people, there has been an innate connection, as you, I think it's Jared, pointed out in your history, to the land of Israel in every aspect of Jewish culture, from the religious aspects to the cultural aspects to the way sanctuaries are built, all placed in Jerusalem. So there's very much this long connection of returning to the homeland that the Jewish people were exiled from, and with the exception of very small, you know, presences, you know, as a largely exiled from, exiled from. So the whole view of like framing Zionism, or I don't like the word Zionism because, as you pointed out, the meaning of it has changed so much over the years, and it is used by different people to mean different things. But the strong connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel doesn't seem to really, struggling to understand how you see that strong connection. And the idea of colonialism, when there isn't a mother country, there isn't a mother country where Jews ever want to return to. There's been an exile of the Jewish people from the land for 2,000 years, and across that time there's been a will to return. So where do you see that? I'm interested in hearing your views on that.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question there. I know there are there people online with questions? Sorry, just
Not yet.
okay. Then please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Shabalin is the name. Thank you so much. I think we learned quite a bit, and I think Leslie referred to the fact that some of the information we could gather today was actually quite useful. From a more practical point of view, I was responsible for bringing Ilan Poppy down in 2014. And we've arranged for him to visit, amongst other places, the Herzlieb, and it was done. It was all organized by a young lady, Vanessa Cohen. And on the day he was supposed to visit, it was cancelled. And the question I have now is there work being done amongst those of us who now understand that there's a genocide happening, that those kids who clearly been brainwashed at the school, such as Herzlieb, that they can actually be unschooled in terms of what they now see and are being taught. Because clearly, there's quite a bit of brainwashing happening with propaganda that they are being fed for years since their preschool days. Is there a program on a more positive note that can be done, if there is at all, that starts to have that kind of communication between the younger Jewish children and obviously what they now see as you know, what's happening. I'm not going to repeat some of the other things that happen. Maybe I was just a bit of a plug, if it's okay. Megan, myself, and Tariq, who's here, putting a project together that's play on Palestine that you will hear quite soon. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to say thank you to, can you hear me? So on the question of indigeneity, the Israeli Foreign Ministry has gone to some effort in establishing the Zion Museum in Jerusalem, which is Israel's first indigenous museum, indigenous embassy in a museum. And I'd really like, you know, to hear what you may think about that, having it in a museum, but also established as an embassy. What's concerning is the fact that a number of First Nation groups have been contacted, especially right-wing Christian Zionist leadership in First Nation caucuses in New Zealand, Australia, North and South America, all over the show, including some so-called representatives here who claim to be the regents of the Khoi Kingdom of Southern Africa. and they were sent over, well, flown over, and have been participating in various forms of asbara, with videos of certain leaders holding traditional objects, espousing their indigeneity, saying that this is the land of Jews, and that this is this first indigenous right of return. And I think there needs to be some pushback in as far as how there is an indigenous washing, but also the deployment of other indigenous communities that are themselves going through the problems of having genocide being recognized, and historical, colonial, spatial, apartheid, spatial planning, and so on, and restitution and all that kind of thing. But it's being re-embezzled into this particular narrative, which then comes to my second question, which is the role of Christian Zionism and the extent to which there is there's conferencing around the manifestation of white supremacy between the two. And so from the Jewish Zionist line and Christian Zionism, I'd love to hear what your sense is.
I'm sorry I'm late. I couldn't find the venue. And I've got another engagement at 3:30, so I will be a little rude and leave after this. But I think my reason of coming here was not so much just to participate in this discussion that's taking place, but definitely to come and thank the Jewish community. I don't think you guys take enough credit for what you guys have done for Palestinian cause. My teams on the other side, I've lost 175 family members in my team. I've lost head of office, I've lost every single building in Gaza. And I've seen the suffering of the Palestinian people. And I'd like to give credit to the Jewish community. You've got the fear, the risk, the swearing, the insult. You've taken something on. I don't really think that the Muslim community also knows the amount that you sacrifice. And our aim is to bring the Muslim community closer to you. We have lost Jewish friends, but you've gained a lot of Muslim friends. I've gained more Jewish friends now after October 7th than before October 7th. So I've come to learn more about you now than I knew before October 7th. And it's all good things that I see. We're so connected religiously and in every other way. But I think it's only fair to come and give credit to you and your whole team. You guys stand up selflessly. You're the first guys in the markets, the first guys in all seminars, the first guys take a stand in every issue. Yet at the beginning, I got a lot of calls from Jewish people who say, we're scared of the Zionists, we can't speak, we can't say anything. You guys have just broken that mold. I think you guys have put fear into the Zionists, to be quite honest. And the people who are asking the questions here who are looking at mindset change, we appreciate that. And also, it's given us an opportunity to teach our own communities that Jews are not Zionists, that they're not bad, that they're not our enemy, that we all got things in common. And it's an educational process for us and our children, our grandchildren, that we have common thinking, common humanity, and we need to think together and work together. So on behalf of my teams that have died in Palestine, and the Palestinian people, and the South African Muslim community, the humanity in general, I'd just like to say thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the first question, but first I want to talk quickly about the fact that Herzliya disinvited I mean, that's not surprising at all. I am surprised that you didn't serve them in the first place. There's a reason why we're having this here instead at the Jewish Center here on campus. We're not allowed there. We're not welcome there. And so it's not surprising. And it's funny that they talk about freedom of speech on campus, but that they don't allow that kind of freedom of speech for us, right? So I wanted to respond to the important question from the back. about these points about the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, of Palestine, of Jerusalem, and the question of colonialism. I think it's a very important question. As I said in my talk, there is a connection, but that connection was always spiritual. There is a historical connection of Jews to Palestine, but that connection isn't of all Jews to Palestine. Some Jews have a kind of can trace a lineage back to living in the land as historic Palestine, but most Jews cannot trace their lineage back to that. There's something called Palestinian Jews. There are a few thousand Palestinian Jews who were from Palestine, have always been part of Palestine, and them along with Christian and Muslim Jews are the indigenous people of Palestine. But the rest of us, Ashkenazi Jews, are not indigenous to Palestine. And we need to make that clear, that we're not indigenous. Because that claim to indigeneity is a lie that is perpetuated in order to claim a colonial right to that land. It's the same, it's kind of similar to how Afrikaners would claim a right to South Africa, that they're indigenous to South because their name is Afrikaner and they've been there for a couple of 100 years, right? So it's that problem we need to be clear about. So the connection to the land of Israel is a spiritual connection, which is what I focus on. The question of colonialism and the mother country. Israel as a colonial entity has a mother country, has two mother countries rather. The original mother country is Britain, and the additional one is now the United States. And Israel is a colonial outpost of those two countries. So in the same way that Algeria was a colonial outpost of France, Israel is a colonial outpost of the United States and Britain. And I hope that kind of clarifies that kind of distinction.
I just wanted to add a single thread around the notion of homeland, which I don't necessarily see as a problem, but I think it's the exclusivity part that becomes a problem. So I think that that it's entirely feasible and viable for Jews to have a relationship with that place, but it does not have a right. Judaism and Jews do not have a right to exclusivity of that place, specifically because there were other people there before.
I think that if you will indulge us, then I would like us to respond. Susan?
I have two questions, and the one question is, can we extend this meeting? So we'll see how long we can go. But the second question is, where did it go? Sorry. Oh yeah, here we go. No, I see it. It says, can I ask the panel if there has been any shift in the position of any of the rabbis in South Africa? And I believe this question comes from Jeff Jowitz.
I wanted to just answer the one question from the previous round.
Yes.
Okay. So I think this is fascinating. I didn't know about this specifically, but I actually think it's a welcome kind of counter narrative to some of what we're hearing around the kind of colonial denialism. Because I do think, I'm interested in question marks. I even, as a bad Jew, have a tattoo of a question mark. And I think I'm interested in why we want to be asking these questions when I think it is quite self-evident that Israel is a colonial state. And I think there's, and I also understand it at the same time, because I think this is awful to hear, but not very surprising. And I think if you look back at how do you build a mythology, it's partly based on culture. And I think this idea of an indigenous internationalism that I think is able to bypass some kind of, to kind of fetishize or neoliberalize this, you know, to kind of get, I don't know the details of what you're talking about, but I think we've seen quite a lot of that before. And I think part of that is a huge thing of cultural mythos. And I think even so from the 70s, for example, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem has had their archaeological projects, right, where they are doing this kind of excavation and replanting of so-called kind of artifacts from antiquity to prove unending lineage. Kind of, it's almost like present. And I believe the Kaplan Center was involved in that from the 70s. So I think these, there's this to say whether it's through food. I was reading a book the other day that was written in the 40s, and it was sort of in Yiddish, in German, in Polish, and in Hebrew, and it was saying, for the women, now you have to cook for the nation. So this is the tip, because many of these women have come from Eastern Europe, and to kind of cook like an Israeli. So I think part of this was part of a very sustained and very careful process to sediment this idea. And I think just to kind of come back to your point at the back there, I think the way I hope I'm not stepping over boundaries, but I think the way Mecca might exist in relation to Islam as a holy site, I think so Jerusalem also does in relation to Islam, and has as some kind of spiritual place. The idea of it as a homeland geographically is a myth. It's not true. Jews have been diasporic for millennia. Zionism has existed very, very recently in political history. Jews have been a diasporic people where there has been reference to Israel or Yisrael in the Talmudic sense. It meant the people, right? It doesn't refer to a political geography, because that reference predates the existence of the nation state. So I think that's useful to keep in mind.
That's just one addition to that, and then another point. Joe mentioned the Kaplan Center's link to Hebrew University, which I think is worth dwelling on a bit. This was directly cited within the affidavit the UCT to court. And just for some context, Hebrew University has been involved in forced displacement in East Jerusalem. They currently have a military base on campus. They work with a company who works very closely at Lockheed Martin, and one of the leading producers of military research. Just to add a bit of contextualize exactly what these Israeli institutions are part of. Second thing, just to touch on briefly, is the incredibly kind words from Imtiaz and Gift of the Givers. I think, they really reverberate and they mean a lot, but similar to what I think Jared and Joe were saying about just putting the victimization SAJFP members get into proportion, I think it's also important to put the work we do into the proportion, into proportion of what it is. And I say that because of how crudely Zionists will weaponize and contort this understanding of anti-Semitism, often our voice does carry more weight within certain spaces to counter those accusations. So there is legitimate power attached to that. But equally, while having that power, one can also derive a lot of, personal gain. SAJFP within many organizational spaces will receive a lot more praise, a lot more thanks, a lot more people be much more happy for us to be there doing the labor, when oftentimes we're doing the exact same labor, if not less labor than most of the other people involved in the pro-Palestinian movement, and generally people who are largely women of color in my experience. So I think that's the point, to just contextualize that this is work we're actively committed to within the sense of Doikite, and really appreciate the fact that the impact of it is felt in certain senses, but just as, not to, exceptionalize our victimization, that the work we do it's very much, it's different to what the act work a lot of our comrades are actively contributing, perhaps even more intensely.
Could we take quickly the question on rabbis? And I don't know if that some of our members, might.
I think that we need to just take, some of us are teaching at 4 o'clock and
Yes.
also, so we will need to just answer the question on the rabbis and then maybe just take one more question.
And then just say that.
Or 2 more
you can stick
questions.
around.
And there's tea in the back.
You can stick around, so if you have questions.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that point. Thanks, Anna. Just say there is tea in the back and the space is open. So for those of you who don't have to teach or go to class, we'll be here and we can stay and continue to have this conversation. So thank you.
I wanted to say that Anthony is best placed to answer the question about the rabbis.
Perfect, Anthony. Rabbi Anthony.
So obviously, SAJFP is a large organization with governments and we have different backgrounds. Big pillars. You could be able to ascertain yourself just by looking at what's publicly available, but there have not been any rabbis in South Africa who have publicly made statements large enough to what you're saying, examining the kinds of things that we're examining. There's a separate question about if there's any progress happening behind the scenes, or there's conversations happening, how people do it. And we have some of us in SAJFP, and in fact, other young progressive Jews, also not in our organization, have engaged in various congregations with various rabbis over the past year. And I think maybe what's encouraging is that a year ago, we had this conversation inside our organization, and 99% of people said it's impossible to wave the flag. No rabbi will talk to you. Because that's the background we grew up with in our communities, in our schools, in our youth movements. And that's not been shown to be the case over the past year. So there are rabbis that we are talking to. There have been some movements, nothing that you're going to see publicly, but we've had some rabbis come to some of our events even. One of the big challenges in South Africa is specifically the most powerful, the single most powerful rabbi in the country, the chief rabbi, Warren Goldstein, personal opinion, I'm sure here, unfortunately, is an extreme Zionist, perhaps one of the most extreme right-wing Zionists, more Zionist than most right-wing Israeli Jews, I would say. When the Pope was ceasefire, the chief rabbi of South Africa said the Pope doesn't understand Catholicism. He said he was going back and read the Bible. So the most powerful rabbi in our country is making it quite difficult, if you are a rabbi, to take a position that is not extremely pro-Israel. And that's one of the power dynamics that's at play here. Right? But again, we are making progress, I believe, in having conversations with various rabbis, and that's ongoing, and it's part of the work.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah.
Know that the current motion to African boycott is levied against Israeli universities in particular, but I understand the immense challenge that you're up against. But I know from what says, it's like even if they are sympathetic to Palestine, the issues are often with funding and Israel makes it America. So how do we negotiate, I guess, the grand America in these calls to boycotts, if it seems most of this money is coming from there, really? And my second question, maybe also quite like a longer seminar. Do you think that anti-Semitism in South Africa is a structural form of racism?
Okay. So the issue of funding and the question of the UCT boycotts and everything. I guess I will say firstly that I think the threat, there is the possibility of funding, being lost, but the threat is a lot more exaggerated than I think it actually is. And secondly, how dare they blackmail us?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I think also if we're being forced to ask questions about whether there's going to be funding for life-saving research or we must be acquiescent to a genocide, what is that?
That's also the question of
no, not you.
The target America more broadly, because it seems like most of Israel's fuel is coming from America.
Yeah.
So is it possible to make the boycott a bigger demand?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think that's a good. I mean, I can just answer. As far as I know, I think this is typically so it's the Pact B boycott, right, which has been in place for over a decade now. And it's a specific call from Palestinian universities, trade unions, civil society, through the BNC, the Boycott National Mission in Ramallah. So it's a response to a call. I think there's absolutely space for expanding that. But as far as I'm sure the senators will be able, there's a Pact B call around boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which has been ongoing for a long time. I think, but yeah. On the structural racism, I think, and this is going to be the point too with it, but I think if we look at specifically white and Jews in the, so first of all, I think we live in a kind of colonized, globalized world where our forms of racism and structures are interconnected, and I think there's local specificities. I think one of the kind of, and I'm sure Mitch will also speak to this in his talk in a few, one of the kind of places of the white Jew in relation to a context of global anti-Black has actually been to police the boundaries of white. So that's where I think it's where I come to this Holocaust exceptionalism point that I also think around the exceptionalism of anti-Semitism, where anti-Blackness is the constitutive condition of modernity, right? And anti-Semitism, and specifically, I would call Judeophobia, is I think a Christian nationalist kind of Zionist project, and also Jewish nationalist, but to say we can police the boundaries, and that's very much what happened in the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, was that even these white and Jews can become, and it's sort of predicated on a foundational white supremacy. So I think it's an interesting question. I don't think it's anything to, as I sort of put it there, but yeah.
I think, yeah, this is a different thing.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to say very special thank you to Anna, to Jamie, to Jared, to Joe, to Megan, to all of you here for this conversation. There is tea in the back, so we can stay and continue this conversation. I also want to highlight two more opportunities for discussion. And that is happening on Friday, the 4th of October, between 2:30 and 4:30, where Mitch Hunter, whose name has been mentioned quite a few times here, Mitch Hunter will be speaking on how Jewish people became white in South Africa, which was actually one of the talking points. Jamie, you really gave such a beautiful overview of that. And then another seminar on children in Gaza, which is next Friday, the 27th of September, between 2:30 and 4:30 at the Neville Alexander Building, which is on Lower Campus. And I can circulate these details. Absolutely, I don't know how you all find yourself here in anthropology, but we're really so humbled by your presence and attendance. So we'll make those meetings available to everyone. And this was just sort of a first step for much longer conversations that we'll have. And Jared.
Just one more announcement. The 5th, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the 5th of October, there's going to be a big march to Parliament. We're calling on the government to institute an anti-apartheid bill to oppose apartheid anywhere in the world. And so hopefully all of you can attend the march, and you can welcome to connect with me if you want to know more about it. We don't have any flyers with us. We ran out. Sorry.
All right.
Okay.
Final, and Jamie has a final announcement as well.
If there's any Jewish students who happen to be here who would be interested in joining our reading group, immediately engage us on these conversations and science things further, just speak me afterwards.
Thank you so much. So with that, thank you so much to everyone.